The night was quiet, too quiet. Officer Mark Reynolds had spent the last 7 years patrolling these streets, and he had learned to trust his instincts. Tonight, something felt off. The usual hum of the city, distant sirens, the chatter of late-night commuters, the occasional honk of a taxi was absent. Instead, an eerie stillness filled the air, as if the city itself was holding its breath. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the empty sidewalks as his squad car crawled down the dimly lit street. Then, out of nowhere, a blur of movement darted into the road. His foot slammed on the brake. The car screeched to a halt. A dog. It stood there, right in the middle of the street, its body tense, its dark eyes locked onto him. Mark exhaled sharply, relieved it wasn't something worse. But something about the animal made him pause. It wasn't just a stray looking for scraps. Its stance was rigid, its fur bristling, its gaze unwavering, and then he saw it. The dog's mouth curled back in a low, almost inaudible growl. It wasn't running. It wasn't scared. It was guarding something. Mark slowly stepped out of the car, his hand resting near his holster. Years of training told him to be cautious. His radio crackled to life on his shoulder, but he ignored it. His focus was locked on the dog. "Easy there, buddy," he muttered, taking a slow step forward. The dog didn't move. It stood its ground, blocking the sidewalk, as if daring him to come closer. Mark took a deep breath. His job wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about reading situations, understanding them before reacting. He knew that pulling his weapon should always be the last resort. But something in his gut told him this dog wasn't here by accident. Then he noticed what lay behind the dog. His stomach clenched. A shadowy figure, motionless on the cold pavement. A person. Mark's heart pounded as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. I have an unresponsive individual on..." A sudden snarl cut through the air. The dog lunged. Instinct took over. Mark's hand moved faster than his mind, and before he could think, before he could stop himself, his gun was drawn. The shot rang out. The dog's body went rigid. A sharp yell piercing the silence, and then, just as quickly, it was over. A painful stillness settled over the street. Mark's breath came in short gasps as he stared at the fallen animal, his ears ringing from the gunfire. His pulse was racing, but in that moment, everything else seemed frozen. Then, a voice shattered the silence, a weak, hoarse whisper from behind him. "No, not him." Mark spun around. His breath caught in his throat. The person on the ground was moving, their hand trembling as they reached forward. "Please," the voice rasped. "That was my dog." Mark felt his chest tighten. He took a step closer, his mind racing with questions. Who was this person? Why was the dog protecting them? And why did he feel like he had just made a terrible mistake? What Mark didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this was only the beginning. Because in the next few moments, he would learn the truth. And it would change everything. Mark's pulse was still pounding in his ears as he took a step toward the injured figure on the ground. The voice had been weak, barely more than a whisper, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. Pain, desperation, and something else, something that made his chest tighten. Regret. He turned back toward the dog, its body lying motionless on the pavement, and a sick feeling twisted in his stomach. He had fired without thinking, without fully understanding the situation. The years of training, the endless reminders about assessing before reacting, all of it had vanished in the heat of the moment. Mark swallowed hard, pushing the guilt aside. He had to focus. The person on the ground shifted slightly, trying to sit up. In the dim glow of the streetlights, he could finally see their face. A man, no older than his mid-30s, his skin pale and drenched in sweat. His clothes were tattered, his hands dirty, and his eyes were filled with something deeper than pain. "Don't move," Mark said quickly, kneeling beside him. "Help is on the way." The man barely seemed to hear him. His gaze was locked on the fallen dog, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. A soft, broken sound escaped his lips, a sound that made Mark's stomach clench. "You don't understand," the man murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't just a dog," Mark exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "Then, help me understand," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Who was he?" The man swallowed, his hands trembling as he reached toward the lifeless animal. His fingers barely brushed the coarse fur before he let out a shaky breath. "His name was Shadow," he whispered, "and he saved my life." A cold gust of wind swept through the empty street, but Mark barely felt it. Something about the way the man spoke, so raw, so full of grief, sent a chill through him. He didn't need to ask for more. The answer was already there, written in the man's eyes, in the way he clung to the dog's presence, even now. Shadow hadn't been just a pet. He had been this man's protector. Mark ran a hand down his face, suddenly feeling the weight of his own actions like never before. He had pulled the trigger on an animal that had been doing exactly what it was meant to do: defend the person it loved. He took a slow breath. "What happened?" he asked. The man hesitated, glancing away. "It's complicated," he muttered. Mark's studied him, his instincts kicking in. He had seen this look before, worn by people who carried burdens too heavy for words, people who had suffered, who had lost more than they could ever explain. This wasn't just about the dog. This was about something much bigger. Before Mark could press further, the distant wail of an ambulance cut through the night. Red and blue, lights flashed against the nearby buildings, illuminating the man's hollow face. Paramedics rushed over, but the man barely reacted. His eyes remained on Shadow, as if looking away would make it all real. Mark took a step back, watching as the medics checked him over. His mind was a storm of unanswered questions. Who was this man? Why was he out here, in the dead of night, with a dog willing to fight for him? And why did Mark have the unshakable feeling that he had just stepped into something far more complicated than a routine call? Then, just as one of the paramedics helped the man onto the stretcher, something happened that made Mark's breath catch. The man turned his head ever so slightly, his gaze meeting Mark's, and in that moment, the fear in his expression shifted. Not fear of pain, not even fear of loss, fear of something else, something much worse. And just before the doors of the ambulance closed, he said one last thing, his voice barely loud enough for Mark to hear. "They'll come for me now." Mark's blood ran cold. Who? And why did he sound so certain? A heavy silence settled as the ambulance pulled away, leaving Mark standing alone in the middle of the empty street. The wind whispered through the alleyways, carrying the echoes of the man's words with it. Mark had thought this was just another night on patrol. He was wrong. This was just the beginning. Mark stood frozen in the middle of the street, the echo of the man's last words ringing in his ears. "They'll come for me now." The words carried weight, fear woven into each syllable. Whoever this man was, whatever he had been running from, it wasn't over. Mark's gaze drifted to the spot where Shadow had fallen. The dog had stood its ground, unwavering, until the very end. And now, looking back, Mark knew Shadow hadn't been attacking. He had been protecting. Not just out of instinct, but out of loyalty. A sharp gust of wind cut through the silence, snapping Mark back to reality. He turned toward his squad car, his mind racing. There were too many unanswered questions, and he wasn't the type to walk away without finding the truth. Back at the station, Mark pulled every report he could find on unidentified homeless men in the area, checking for anything that matched. The man's description. Hours passed, the dull hum of fluorescent lights overhead doing little to keep his exhaustion at bay. And then, he found it, a missing persons report. Ethan Cole, a former investigative journalist who had disappeared nearly 2 years ago after working on an exposé about high-profile corruption. The details were vague, but one thing was clear. Ethan had made enemies, dangerous ones. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Ethan had vanished without a trace. Until tonight, until he was found in the middle of the street, his only protection lying lifeless at his side. Mark didn't believe in coincidences. Just as he was piecing everything together, a call came through his radio. Officer down, unknown suspects, ambulance. En route, the location sent a jolt through him. The hospital. Mark grabbed his keys and bolted. By the time he arrived, the emergency room was in chaos. Officers were already swarming the entrance. The red glow of flashing lights bouncing off the white walls. Mark pushed through the crowd, his heart hammering. "Where is he?" he demanded. A nurse shook her head, her face pale. "They took him," Mark's breath caught. "Who?" "We don't know," she whispered. "They stormed in. They knew exactly who they were looking for." His gut twisted. The fear in Ethan's voice. The way he had said they. It all made sense now. Ethan had been running. Shadow had been his only line of defense. And now, without him, they had come back to finish what they started. Mark clenched his fists. He had hesitated once before, and it had cost an innocent life. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. He turned on his heel, already reaching for his radio. "I need every available unit. Now." The city blurred past him as he drove, his mind racing. Whoever had taken Ethan, they had done so quickly and efficiently. That meant they weren't just criminals. They were professionals. A lead finally broke through. A black van spotted fleeing the scene, heading toward the docks. No license plates, no identification. Mark's grip tightened on the wheel as he floored the gas. By the time he reached the docks, the van was there, parked under a broken streetlight. No movement, no sound, just the quiet lapping of waves against the pier. He stepped out cautiously, his gun drawn. The air was thick with tension. Then, a noise. A muffled shout from inside a nearby warehouse. "Ethan!" Mark moved fast, slipping into the shadows, his instincts on high alert. The warehouse was dark, the only light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. He could hear voices, low, hushed, urgent, and then without warning, gunfire. Mark dove behind a stack of crates. As bullets ripped through the air, he returned fire, each shot precise, controlled. The figures in the shadows scattered. The chaos was his advantage. In the midst of the fight, a figure staggered toward him. Ethan. His hands were bound, his face bruised, but he was alive. Mark reached him just as another shot rang out. He spun, firing back, and the last attacker fell. Silence. Ethan gasped for breath. "Shadow," he murmured, his voice breaking. Mark's chest tightened. There was nothing he could say that would bring the dog back, but he could at least make sure. Ethan lived. That justice was served. Within minutes, backup arrived. The men who had taken Ethan, exposed for who they were. Corrupt officials. People who had wanted him silenced, but they had failed. Ethan was safe, and though Shadow was gone, his sacrifice had not been in vain. As Mark stood on the pier, watching the flashing lights reflect against the water, he felt the weight of the night settle over him. He had made a mistake, one he could never take back. But he had also done something else. He had made it right, and in the end, maybe that was all any of them could do.